Order. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I'd like to recognize our new committee members who are participating in the first hearing today. I'm thrilled to have my fellow Floridian Ashley Moody, John Husted here from the great state of Ohio, join the committee. Inflation, which is caused by massive government spending, has been a serious issue plaguing American families and their seniors over the past 4 years. In today's hearing, you will hear me talk about the causes and impacts of inflation, but also why I'm very optimistic about the future and the opportunity to bring fiscal sanity back to Washington and solve the problems facing seniors. Let's be clear how we got here. Over the past 4 years, while the U.S. population has grown just 2%, federal spending has increased by 53%, and all that spending has added more than $8 trillion to America's national debt, which today is more than $36 trillion. This kind of spending just isn't sustainable. If nothing changes, our federal government is on track to add $1 trillion to the federal debt about every 100 days or so. The cost of this debt is another massive problem. Right now, more than $1 trillion of the money that hard-working Americans pay in taxes each year goes to paying the interest on the federal debt. Having $1 trillion in annual interest expense is not sustainable either. Every dollar we are spending on interest is a dollar that isn't funding an important program seniors rely on or going toward the federal government keeping its promises to provide a return on the return on investment of American taxpayers. Just think about it, that money was going in to prop up Medicare and Social Security. Those numbers are massive and difficult to even wrap your mind around, but here's what every American, and especially every senior, understands very well. The inflation caused by all this government spending is out of control and it has to be stopped. Any of us who went through a campaign this last cycle know the impact it's had on our seniors. Since January 2021, overall inflation is up over 20%. But when you look at the specific things that nearly every American spends their money on, prices are way up more than 20%. Here's just a few examples. Eggs up 160%, coffee's up 41%, oranges up 33%, energy costs up 32%, new car prices up 29%, and household debt is up more than 21% because our families just can't keep up. According to research done by the Joint Economic Committee, the average American household needs over $13,000 more per year than they did 4 years ago just to maintain their same standard of living. For seniors, many of whom are on fixed incomes, skyrocketing prices are not simply an inconvenience, but a threat to their ability to retire, make ends meet, and for far too many, keep food on the table. That is unacceptable. It should never happen in our country. Like a lot of us, I grew up in a family that didn't have a lot of money. I watched my parents struggle to find work and provide for our family. That's why this issue is very important to me. And here's why I'm optimistic about the future. I know that with Donald Trump, we will all work together, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, which is what it takes to turn this country around and get our fiscal house in order. This isn't a partisan issue. I know that every one of us here in the Senate has heard countless stories from folks in our states about the pain caused by inflation. I'm optimistic about getting this done because I know it can happen. I know it because I was able to turn around Florida when I became governor back in January 2011. We had lost 800,000 jobs, we hadn't balanced the budget, we had growing debt, and we had a shrinking population. When I left office in 2018, we had cut taxes 100 times, slashed more than 5,000 burdensome regulations to make government more efficient, paid down over $10 billion of our state debt, and businesses, private businesses, not government, had added 1.7 million new private sector jobs, and our revenue skyrocketed. When government is efficient, the economy grows and tax revenues increase so we can keep our promises to seniors and all Americans who work hard, pay their taxes, and deserve a government that is accountable to them. We did in Florida. We can make this turnaround happen in Washington, too. My hope in highlighting these issues is to begin a productive dialogue with everyone in this room, and it takes Republicans, Democrats, and independents to work on this so that we can fix problems, promote good ideas that stop inflation, and make Washington work for our seniors. It's also why I'm excited to be part of the DOGE caucus here in the Senate and work with President Trump and Elon Musk to make sure we get back on track. I look forward to working with Ranking Member Gillibrand and all our colleagues in this committee to discuss ways to make Washington work for America's seniors, which starts with getting our fiscal house in order so the federal government keeps its promises to elderly Americans, ensures they can enjoy their golden years with the peace of mind of having fiscal sanity, also gives us every opportunity to make sure we can preserve all the benefits of Medicare and also all the benefits of Social Security, which is important to everybody up here. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Gillibrand for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, for calling today's hearing. These are extremely timely topics. As the Aging Committee, it's our role to amplify the voices of older adults and seek to understand and address the problems that they're facing every day. As such, I think it is relevant that one of our first conversations on this committee is about financial stability. Many Americans have faced increased costs over the past few years, from the cost of our groceries, such as eggs and meat and bread and milk, to our costs of medicine, key life-saving medicines. Older adults are not exempt from these price increases, and by some accounts, they're getting hit even harder. Older adults living on fixed incomes from their retirement accounts and Social Security benefits can't afford the higher costs they have to pay for food and for housing. The truth is, much of the inflation we are facing today can be traced back to either supply chain shocks triggered by the COVID-19 and global instability, or to corporate profit gouging, just wanting to make more money, or, like we've seen with the price of eggs, avian flu. The Federal Reserve accounted for all the inflation in the first year of the pandemic recovery, were these shocks from supply chain and COVID. However, I think this committee should be focused on one thing: how do we help older adults who are struggling to afford those essentials today? I first must address the recent attempts by the Trump administration to block federal funding. These freezes are very serious. The Trump administration has violated the law and released an order that has put all Americans, and especially older adults, at risk. The order, which in a chaotic move has now been reversed on paper but not in actuality, is jeopardizing our funding that supports medical research, our law enforcement officers, our firefighters, our community health centers, our nutrition programs, the SNAP benefits that a lot of seniors rely on, including Meals on Wheels, which, as you know, might be the only hot meal a senior might get in a day and might be the only visitor that week, and potentially Medicaid. We can't have a meaningful conversation about supporting older adults when the administration is doing something so disruptive and so harmful to our seniors. Social Security, as we know, is a lifeline for older adults across this country. Estimates show that Social Security keeps 16.3 million older adults out of poverty. We need to be working on how to strengthen Social Security benefits and make sure that the monthly benefits are received adequately cover the cost of living. Medicaid, Medicare, the SNAP program are critical to the survival of our seniors. So as a committee, I'm looking forward to making sure our older adults have access to the food, the medicine, the medical care, and other financial support that they need. I'm very excited about our witnesses today and for this hearing to begin to have this discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Gillibrand. Now let me introduce our first witness. Mr. Ferry is the Chief Economist Emeritus at the Coalition for a Prosperous America. He holds economic degrees from Harvard and the London School of Economics. On the course of his career, Mr. Ferry has advocated for strengthening the American economy and protecting American workers and industry. With decades of expertise in trade, manufacturing, and economic policy, he has been a strong voice on how we can rebuild and sustain a strong, competitive economy. Thank you for being here, Mr. Ferry.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the opportunity, Senator and Ranking Member. The founder of Soviet communism, Vladimir Lenin, is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily, and while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction. That's a quote from the great British economist John Maynard Keynes. Many people think that Keynes was pro-inflation, but that's not true. Keynes lived through the 1920s and saw what hyperinflation did to Poland, Russia, Austria, and especially Germany, where the hyperinflation of 1923 shook the faith of the German people in democracy with disastrous results. Keynes advocated balanced government budgets except in times of serious recession or depression. The fundamental cause of inflation in an economy is an excess of demand over supply. Excessive demand can be caused by a number of things, including an excessive government budget deficit, too much money printing, or wage push inflation, which is accommodated by the government. In the U.S., in 2021 and 2022, inflation took off, reaching a high of 9% in 2022, the highest rate since the early 1980s. The cause of this inflation was excessive demand colliding with restrained supply. As we all recall, the supply of goods from Asia was severely restrained in 2020 by the worldwide COVID pandemic and then the backlog at all the major ports. On the demand side, the federal government enacted 3 separate measures to support people during the COVID pandemic. The third of those, the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, was too much money at precisely the wrong time, when the country was going back to work and people were rushing out to use their savings to purchase goods. That led to a surge in the price of goods, everything from the food at the grocery store to home appliances to new cars. These forces led inflation to reach 9% in 2022. Could this have been prevented? Yes. On the demand side, the American Rescue Plan should have been much smaller. On the supply side, the situation is more complicated. Clearly, the U.S. needs more domestic sources of manufactured goods, and that's something I've been working hard on for several years. Nor was the 9% headline rate the whole story. The prices of some categories of consumer goods shot up by much more. For example, in December 2022, the price of eggs was up 59% year on year, the price of margarine up 44%, airfares up 28%, and even the humble lettuce was up 25%. These high inflation rates hurt many groups, especially seniors. Many seniors live on a fixed income. The average Social Security payment in the U.S. is now $1,976 a month. According to a study by University of Massachusetts economists, that covers just 68% of basic living expenses for an elderly single person who rents their home. According to the National Council on Aging, 14% of people over 65 live in poverty today. They say aging with dignity should be a right for all of us, and I think that's right. Other expenses paid by the elderly continue to rise. Seniors still pay significant co-pays for prescription drugs, and studies have shown that a significant percentage of seniors are doing without these drugs because they can't make ends meet. Home health care services and related services were up 9.5% in December 2024. That's on top of the inflation of 2021 and 2022. So what can be done about inflation? Most important, we need to get the federal budget deficit down. The best way to think about inflation is, are we as a nation consuming more than we produce, or are we keeping within our budgets? For over 40 years, this nation has run trade deficits, meaning we borrow billions of dollars from abroad to consume more than we produce. For 24 consecutive years, the federal government has run a large budget deficit, meaning the federal government spends billions and now trillions of dollars more than it takes in revenue. A budget deficit of 7% of GDP is far too high. We need to cut government spending aggressively. I applaud incoming Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's 3% target for the federal deficit. That will ease inflationary pressures and reduce interest rates. Supply-side reforms can also make a significant difference and make prices less rigid and less likely to rise. We need to make it more economic for people to go to work so we can increase the supply of labor and restrain the cost of labor. And we can do this by fixing the tax and welfare system to provide more incentives. Finally, we import far too much. Restraining imports will stimulate domestic production, helping to improve the supply-demand balance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ferry. Now I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Gillibrand to introduce the next witness.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I want to introduce our second witness, Mr. Alex Lawson. Mr. Lawson is the Executive Director of Social Security Works, where he works to advocate on behalf of Americans for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Thank you for being here, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and distinguished members of the committee. As Executive Director of Social Security Works, I travel across this country and speak with legions of primarily seniors, almost to a person. They are concerned with rising costs. These rising prices hurt older Americans, endangering their ability to afford food, housing, prescription drugs, and they want Congress to take action. Across the country, there is bipartisan agreement on what people want: cracking down on corporate price gouging, improving Social Security's annual cost of living adjustments, and reducing the price of prescription drugs by expanding Medicare's power to negotiate. These are actionable policies that will help older Americans adjust to inflation caused by global supply chain shocks and greedflation, which has contributed to rising costs over the past few years. In fact, the Federal Reserve found that corporate profits accounted for all of the inflation in the first year of the pandemic recovery and 41% of inflation overall in the first 2 years of the post-pandemic recovery. There is also bipartisan agreement across this country about what people don't want in response to rising prices. Republicans, independents, Democrats all agree that not one single penny should be cut from Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other benefits. There is absolute bipartisan agreement among people everywhere in this country except here in Washington, D.C. Here, you have a Republican majority who's announced proposals to slash trillions of dollars from Medicaid, our country's largest provider of long-term care. Over 9 million Americans over 65 rely on Medicaid. Cuts to Medicaid would force these seniors and their families to pay enormous out-of-pocket costs for long-term care, money they don't have. It would force millions of caregivers, most often women, out of the workforce. This would make it far harder for American families to pay their monthly bills. In addition, these proposals also include cuts to SNAP benefits, which 4.8 million older Americans rely on to put food on the table. Just last week, the new Trump administration repealed an executive order from President Biden that directed the federal government to find ways to lower drug prices. The Trump administration is already favoring big pharma at the expense of seniors and working families. There have also been calls by Republicans to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which gives Medicare the power to negotiate lower prices on key prescription drugs. This could force many seniors to cut their life-sustaining medication in half due to higher costs. Many others would face a terrible choice between buying food, filling their prescription, or paying their heating bills. Even Social Security, the most popular and effective program in America, is not safe. Last month, a Republican representative who's a member of the Doge caucus, like Chairman Scott, told me personally that there will be some cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Let me be clear, these proposed cuts will do nothing to lower costs for average Americans or older adults. These cuts are being proposed to offset the cost of tax handouts for billionaires and corporations who've been shown to be responsible for rising costs themselves. This Congress should value the interest of older adults above the wealthiest Americans, and I hope that the Aging Committee will lead that charge. Consider this. If an older adult cannot afford their drugs and groceries at the average Social Security benefit of about $1,900 a month. It's absolute fiscal insanity to think the solution is to cut their income, to take away their health care, to destroy Medicaid, and force them to pay the average long-term care costs of around $100,000 a year. If they can't afford the price of eggs, it's absolute fiscal insanity to believe they can afford them better without SNAP benefits. I'm here to deliver a message to the members of this committee from older Americans. Across this country, they say, you don't lower prices by stealing people's health care. You don't lower prices by giving giant tax cuts to billionaires and price gouging corporations. And you absolutely don't lower prices by reducing the Social Security and other benefits that adults have worked their entire lives to earn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Just so you know, I actually don't know anybody that, there might be, but I don't know anybody that thinks we ought to be cutting the benefits of Medicare, Social Security. It's a big deal in my state. So next I get to hear from my home state of Florida. I'd like to introduce Tarren Bragdon. Mr. Bragdon is the Chief Executive Officer of the Foundation for Government Accountability. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science from the University of Maine and a Master of Science of Business from Hudson University. Prior to joining FGA, Tarren served as the Chief Executive Officer at the Maine Heritage Policy Center. He decided it was way too chilly. He also served in the Maine House of Representatives and remains the youngest person elected to the Maine legislature, serving from 1996 to 2000. Through his organization, Mr. Bragdon has been a steadfast advocate for common sense policies that empower individuals and families to achieve greater economic independence. Mr. Bragdon.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, and members of the committee, thank you so much for this opportunity. The inflationary legacy of the Biden administration has harmed all Americans, but especially seniors. And sadly, this inflation in part is a direct consequence of three major policy failures. One, massive red tape. Two, increased welfare. And three, few work requirements in welfare. This trifecta of bad policy has reaped big inflation. Let me quickly talk about each of them. Number one, massive red tape. Former President Biden issued more costly regulations than any president in modern U.S. history, finalizing more than 300 economically significant regulations during his first term, 40% more than President Obama's first term. In contrast, President Trump delayed more than 1,500 regulatory actions, finalized more than 500 deregulatory actions, and lowered costs by more than $200 billion during his first term. So why does all this matter? Well, for every 15% increase in federal regulations, the cost of consumer goods and services increases by 1 percentage point. That's why President Trump's 10-for-1 deregulation target would directly lower red tape-driven inflation. And it's not just about the federal spending from increased regulations. More regulations mean more compliance costs by businesses, which are ultimately passed along to consumers through price hikes. Overall, the Biden administration expansion of the regulatory state added $1.7 trillion worth of new costs to taxpayers over a decade. Number two, increased welfare. In 2021, the Biden administration pushed through a 27% increase in food stamp benefits. After failing to receive congressional approval for an increase in the Thrifty Food Plan, the Biden administration unilaterally used guidance to increase this, or to create this $250 billion welfare expansion, the largest in the program's history. So why would an increase in government welfare increase inflation for all Americans? Well, as government spending on food stamp increases, purchases made by food stamp recipients drive up grocery prices through the natural laws of supply and demand. In fact, researchers at the World Bank reviewed more than a decade of retail data to measure this impact. And here's what they found: that food prices increase by 1% for every 12.5% increase in food stamp spending. So you have that 13-to-1 ratio in the increase in welfare spending, very similar to that 15-to-1 ratio I talked about with more red tape driving higher inflation. Number three, few work requirements in welfare. The Biden administration's food stamp expansion not only spiked grocery prices, but it also led to millions of Americans choosing welfare over work. In fact, an estimated 2.4 million Americans declined employment due to this increase. In addition, the Biden administration pushed several pro-welfare policies, everything from rescinding Medicaid work requirements to gutting program integrity and anti-fraud provisions, to expanding exemptions and waivers of food stamp work requirements. The number of able-bodied people on Medicaid and food stamps is higher today than it was when the unemployment rate was near 15% during the COVID lockdowns. And in fact, these two programs alone are expected to cost taxpayers close to $9 trillion over the next decade. And more spending in Medicaid and food stamps on able-bodied adults who are working age means less resources available in the safety net for seniors and those with disabilities. In fact, over 60% of able-bodied adults on Medicaid or food stamps do not work at all. And as a result, our labor force participation rate is lower than it was before COVID. My written testimony outlines 9 key policy solutions to reverse this trend, everything from congressional oversight of costly regulations to increased program integrity and expanded work requirements. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Finally, I'd like to introduce E.J. Antoni. Mr. Antoni is an economist and research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Grover Hermann Center for the Federal Budget. His work has been featured with a variety of news outlets, including Daily Caller, Fox News, and Fox Business, Wall Street Journal, and National Review. Mr. Antoni earned his master's and doctorate in economics from Northern Illinois University, and his contributions help shape public discourse on economic policy and provide valuable insights for policymakers and the public alike.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to discuss with you today the difficulties faced by seniors stemming from the last 4 years of excessive government spending and its subsequent inflation. I'm a public finance economist, the Richard F. Astor Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and a senior fellow at Unleash Prosperity. Under the Biden administration, seniors in America suffered terribly because of failed left-wing ideology masquerading as public policy. 4 years of Washington's prodigal spending drove up the national debt by $8.5 trillion, while the Treasury's cash balance was reduced another $1 trillion. That's a net overspending of $9.5 trillion, or 1/4 of the entire national debt in just 4 years. This runaway spending was primarily financed by the Federal Reserve literally creating money for the Treasury to spend. By flooding the economy with freshly printed dollars, the Fed diluted the value of the currency. Like pouring water into wine, the total volume of liquid increased, but not the amount of alcohol. Likewise, the total quantity of dollars increased, but not the value for which those dollars could be exchanged. We call this monetary phenomenon inflation, and it functions as a hidden tax, transferring wealth from savers and wage earners to the government. In just 4 years, the Biden administration and its congressional allies managed to effectively confiscate 1/5 of the value of all dollars in existence, a devastating tax on Americans, especially seniors. Prices on average rose more than 20%, according to official government statistics, but the cost of many necessities rose much more. Many food staples saw prices increase 40%. The cost of home ownership doubled, and it will cost you 30% more to heat your home this winter. But the 4-decade high inflation also prompted the fastest rise in interest rates in 40 years. This has been a deadly combination for seniors in 2 distinct ways. First, the stratospheric cost of living forced many Americans to fall behind on their bills and rely on debt to make ends meet. Outstanding credit card balances have exploded to $1.2 trillion, even as the average interest rate on those credit cards is near a record high today. Now, for the first time ever, Americans are paying over $300 billion annually just in finance charges on credit card debt, which doesn't include a dime towards paying down those balances. Seniors have been particularly susceptible to this downward debt spiral because they are disproportionately on fixed incomes with little room in their budget for higher costs. But the rapid rise in both inflation and interest rates has also decimated seniors' retirement savings, which tend to be in fixed income assets. Under the Biden administration's profligacy, the bond market had its worst 3.5-year run in at least a century. At the same time, this asset class has significantly underperformed. Retirees also need 20% more savings than just 4 years ago to account for the current cost of living crisis. For the average American senior who was planning on retiring today, he or she will have to work an additional 6 years to recoup these inflation-adjusted losses. Unfortunately, the big spenders in Congress have plenty of apologists who will blame inflation on anything but its cause, which is excess government spending. One of the politicians' favorite scapegoats was, and still is, business. We can dispense with the parochial notion that inflation is caused by the boogeymen of corporate greed or price gouging. Did business magically become greedy precisely when Biden took office and went on a spending spree? Prices aren't higher because margins are fat or margins are flat. Rather, prices are higher because the dollar has gone lower. In fact, the Biden administration's own data prove this point. Costs paid by businesses rose even faster than costs paid by consumers over the last 4 years. Businesses have merely passed their cost increases on to consumers. Inflation comes from Washington, D.C., and whenever the federal budget increases, the family budget decreases. And the inflationary deficit isn't from a lack of revenue. Tax receipts today are at or near a record high by any measure, whether a percentage of GDP or inflation-adjusted dollars, et cetera. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. The current fiscal year is off to its worst start ever, even worse than the blowout spending year of the pandemic. Despite the hole that Biden has dug for seniors, President Trump is offering them a way out. By reining in government spending, we can finally bring inflation to heel. Likewise, expanding energy production will reduce the cost of living while also raising additional tax revenue. Common sense deregulation will also produce these positive effects. Additionally, pro-growth policies that incentivize work will actually increase Social Security and Medicare tax receipts, providing much-needed breathing room for these programs which are approaching insolvency. If this Congress genuinely wants to help seniors, it should join President Trump in shrinking the burden that the government places on its citizens, whether that's explicit taxation, the hidden tax of inflation, burdensome regulation, or another form of government overreach. If Congress wants seniors to continue suffering, then by all means keep in place the Biden policies that got us here. Thank you again for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Antoni. If Senator Kim's ready, you ready to go for questions? And I'll defer mine. Okay, Senator Kim.
Yeah, sure. Happy to jump on in. Mr. Lawson, I wanted to just kind of pick up something you had talked about, just the challenges that seniors face when it comes to long-term care. This is something that my family's been struggling with as my father's having real challenges of decline. And I'll be honest with you, I've heard about this problem and the sheer cost of that from a lot of people in New Jersey, but when you go through it personally, it just was a whole nother level just to see, how much, in New Jersey, if people go in for assisted living or other types of facilities, we're talking upwards $10,000 a month out of pocket. And, it's either that or people having to basically bankrupt themselves until they're eligible for Medicaid. And, I guess, this is something that I hope we can, as a committee, to be able to engage in and try to address. But I guess I just wanted to just hear from you, what are the things that you would recommend this committee diving in on? Like, how can we use this opportunity to really not just hear those problems, but understand that, just the sheer trajectory of crisis that we're in as a country as a whole, but then just how devastating this is for families right now?
It's such an important question. Thank you for asking, Senator. I think the most important thing to talk about when it comes to long-term care is to understand that we do not have a long-term care system in this country. Because of that, people are forced to rely on Medicaid, which is not in and of itself a long-term care system. What you talked about, people having to bankrupt themselves, they call it a spend down. That's so that they can qualify to have their long-term supports and services or long-term care covered. Because otherwise, the families would be bankrupted. they would not be able to afford. The average cost in the whole country is $100,000. So the finding in New Jersey of $1,000 a month is not, $10,000 a month is not at all, out of line with what people would face. So I say that emphatically because there are proposals that are written down by members of the Republicans in Congress to cut $2.3 trillion from Medicaid. And let me be clear of what that would do. It would destroy Medicaid. It wouldn't do anything to fight inflation. It wouldn't bring anybody's prices down. It would just steal people's health care, and it would decimate the ability of millions of people to afford long-term care. And I really urge this committee to make that really clear, that when you're talking about Medicaid, you're talking about the largest provider of long-term care in this country.
Yeah, and really, I mean, you see so few other options that are out there besides, again, out of pocket. And so, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we see this being critical when it comes to the role that Medicaid plays. And again, I've seen that up close and personal. What other steps can we be taking? If I'm certainly gonna try to fight to make sure we're preserving Medicaid, and I hope my colleagues are as well. But even that doesn't solve the problem, right? That's trying to prevent even further backsliding, right? But what else should we be looking at to address? I know there have been proposals to try to bring long-term care into Medicare. There's other types of ideas that are out there. Can you give me a sense of just some of the other things that experts are talking about that we can try to consider here?
Absolutely. The idea of bringing long-term care as a benefit under Medicare is an extremely good idea. Medicare does an incredible job providing services and restraining excess cost growth. It does a much better job than the private alternatives in insurance, and especially in long-term care, because what we've seen is a growing roll-up of the long-term care nursing home system by private equity. So this is by money who look at a nursing home and they don't see it as a place to provide care in the critical end of life period for people. They see life as a time much money out of them. So really in the role that private equity has and in profitizing long-term care and reversing that trend is something that I think is also critical.
Well, thanks so much, and I'll yield back.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Senator. Seniors in Pennsylvania are hurting. Thanks to the reckless spending, including $5 trillion of new spending under President Biden, they've had to deal with runaway inflation. They've seen purchasing power of fixed income evaporate because of bad policy decisions here in Washington, and they've seen the value of their retirement accounts after inflation decreased by almost 10% in the last 4 years. And the cost of elder care, of course, just keeps going up. So prices are up, savings are down, and this can't continue. So thankfully, we're turning the corner and building an economy that works for all Americans, including 2.5 million seniors in Pennsylvania. This starts with reining in federal spending. The federal deficit is now equal to 7% of GDP. Debt is over 120% of GDP. We now spend more on interest on the debt than we do in national defense. At the same time, I think everybody on this committee agrees that we must protect the critical benefits seniors have earned, such as Social Security and Medicare. So we have a difficult question to wrestle with. How do we bring down spending while protecting these critical programs that Americans have paid for and rely on? So with that context in mind, Mr. Ferry, I'd like to start with you as your testimony focused on this very question. What are our best options or low-hanging fruit for reducing the federal deficit while protecting critical programs our seniors rely on?
I think there are a number of federal programs that don't fall in the category of essential spending, as you say, Medicare, Social Security, and defense. And I think these programs are in areas like the Department of Education, where the federal contribution is debatable at best, and I think we can literally cut $1 trillion out of federal spending an annual $1 trillion out of federal spending over the next 5 years. I'll give you another example. Senator Scott didn't mention it, but earlier in my career, I worked in the broadband technology industry, building optical networks that carry internet traffic. I was thrilled when the government passed the broadband program to bring internet to thousands of rural households. The 4 years of the Biden administration went by, and not one single household has been connected. Where I come from in the private sector, if you had that record over 4 years, we would just fire everybody. We'd give them compensation, but we would just say, you need to do better. I think we need to instill that spirit of performance and targets and metrics into the public sector. 5 times the reward, which means, as I say, we can cut spending by $1 trillion a year without touching Medicaid, without Medicare, without touching Social Security, and without touching defense. And although defense is, to be honest, an area where for the $800 billion we spend, we are not getting good value for money. So I don't know that we need to cut it radically. What we need to do is to bring in smaller, more aggressive, more entrepreneurial companies to compete with some of the defense primes. And I think we actually could see our way to reducing defense, but getting better defense worldwide that way.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more on the accountability and focused on outcomes within our government. That's what President Trump, I think, is leading the charge on, and it's got a lot of support here on this committee. Mr. Antoni, let's discuss how the last 4 years have impacted seniors' retirement portfolios. You've been very critical of the Federal Reserve's response to inflation, as have I. Can you walk us through the impacts of Fed policy on 401k accounts? I hear this all the time from seniors in Pennsylvania, and pension plans in general. And how and what can seniors do to protect their retirement accounts from rapidly losing value as they have over the last 4 years?
Well, thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to see a fellow Pennsylvanian, by the way. Unfortunately, what the Federal Reserve did to accommodate the spendthrift policies out of D.C. was, again, literally just create trillions of dollars out of nothing. And to ease the cost of financing all of the borrowing from the Treasury, they pushed interest rates down to zero. So at the same time, all of this debt was being issued, it was being issued at near zero interest rates, and therefore all of the securities that were being issued that used that were essentially the financial derivatives that had these low interest-bearing assets as their underlying asset. That meant that the securities also were going to have very low yields. As soon as interest rates began to rise, since interest rates and prices move inversely with bonds, the value of these securities has absolutely plummeted. We are literally coming off of the worst 3.5-year run for the bond market in over a century. Well, where do seniors disproportionately put their savings? Into fixed income assets. And so they have taken just an absolute wash on their retirement accounts. The average 401k alone, as you pointed out, lost almost 10% of its inflation-adjusted value under the Biden administration. And for seniors, it has been even worse than the average because of that portfolio allocation. Yeah. To answer your question in terms of how can they protect themselves, unfortunately, when it comes to inflation, it's a hidden tax. Like any tax, there's not really a good way to protect yourself aside from simply spend all your money. If you don't have any money, then the government can't take any of it away through inflation. Unfortunately, that's obviously not a very desirable outcome either, though. So really, the best way to protect themselves, I would say, with all due respect, is to vote in politicians who will prevent that kind of overspending and therefore prevent the inflation in the first place.
Thank you.
Ranking Member Gillibrand.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bragdon, you argue that expansion of welfare and safety net programs are the main contributors of inflation and propose that these programs need to be cut significantly. These programs actually prevent millions of Americans from falling deeper into poverty, illness, and food insecurity. For example, SNAP is one of the most effective tools for improving health and preventing hunger, enabling nourishing kids to go to school and adults to go to work. When we cut programs like SNAP and Medicaid, we will surely head towards a nation with poorer health outcomes, increasing hospitalizations, and ballooning our health care costs. So what do you propose we do when millions of Americans go hungry or fall into poverty or become ill without health care coverage because of these cuts?
Senator, thank you for the question. In my testimony, I outlined really two key strategies in right-sizing welfare programs, but also providing incentives for people to move from welfare to work and out of poverty. The only path for an able-bodied adult out of poverty is through work. And there is a broad bipartisan consensus, whether it's in mental health or substance abuse, that work, or for individuals with disabilities, that work is key to a meaningful life. And what we talk about in the testimony is an example after example, an effective work requirement for able-bodied adults of working age is proven to get individuals out of poverty and into the workforce. We have more than 8 million open jobs. Most of those don't require more training than on-the-job training, and that's the path out of poverty. The second piece is—
Could you pause for 1 second, Tarren?
Sure.
Wasn't most of the waiver for work requirements because of COVID?
There's still waivers, even in low unemployment areas. The Biden administration has allowed states broad authority to waive work
But
requirements.
wasn't that due to COVID? I thought all the waivers I think the waivers are no longer in place. They were removed once we got out of COVID. But I thought most of the waivers were because of COVID, because there was so much disruption in the economy and some people weren't able to go back to work because the employers didn't want them to go back to work, or their employers weren't open, or there was so many differences and so many changes.
They were waived for a period of time, but then states can also submit waivers, which they did to USDA in food stamps, saying we want to broadly waive work requirements in certain counties, gerrymandering counties together to create waivers where there's even low
Was that
unemployment.
because of low unemployment? There's no jobs available?
You mean high unemployment in those counties?
No, low unemployment. So I think the unemployment rate's been hovering around 3%. And when unemployment's that low, meaning there's just not that many jobs out there, all the jobs are full. So there's a challenge of finding good jobs. And so we make the trade-off. We'd rather people not starve than require the work requirement. I think a lot of the people who also are considered able-bodied often have, as you said, mental health issues or impediments to work, like an elderly person at home who needs care or a child at home who needs care. What data do you have on that?
Sure. I appreciate the question. So with work requirements in food stamps, an individual, if a doctor says they're not able to work for whatever, whether it's a physical or mental health condition that they have, then they would be exempt from the work requirement. Mm-hmm. States don't have the authority to waive work requirements in low unemployment areas. There is the ability in high unemployment areas for states to waive those work requirements for certain adults with no kids and no disabilities, but not with low unemployment. In fact, there's more than 8 million open jobs across the country, and the path out of poverty is for individuals to go into those open jobs. I know, for example, we have 4 teenagers. My daughter went into one of these open jobs in Florida. She's earning $18 an hour at Jimmy John's, and that's her first job, moving her on the path to prosperity, and it's really helping every American begin their American dream.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Lawson, some Republicans have proposed raising the full retirement age to 69 or 70 to protect Social Security solvency and avoid benefit cuts. This is misleading. Can you share the actual impact of raising the retirement age would have on Social Security benefits and on the adults who rely on them?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Every year the retirement age is raised, it's a 7% benefit cut across the board to everybody's Social Security benefits. It's not like a benefit cut, it is a benefit cut. Because the retirement age really has nothing to do with when you retire, it is just the mathematical point at which you receive your full benefits. So if you raise it, then you're cutting everyone's benefits by 7% per year.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Senator Tupperville.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here this afternoon, fellows. Mr. Ferry, a lot of misconceptions about floating around by the media about tariffs and how they'll hurt the American economy. Can you speak to how tariffs, if they're done right, will boost the economy?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That's an absolutely true statement. Tariffs done right will stimulate our economy. I just want to say, following on from what Mr. Lawson said, that there is no money tree. The percentage of old people in our economy continues to grow. I'm sitting here as a living, breathing example of that. And we have fewer people in work earning, in a sense, less real wages than 50 years ago when we had 4 working people for every retired person. Now we're getting close to 2, I think. So we need to make this economy grow, and we need to raise the real incomes and the value of the production of every single worker. Tariffs are a key way we can do that, because what tariffs do is they handicap imports and they allow domestic production to grow. We want to tariff the high value, highly productive, high growth manufacturing sectors, which is roughly 3/4 of the entire manufacturing sector in the United States. And by doing so, we will produce more cars, more computers, more machinery, more machine tools, more medical equipment, and more steel and more aluminum, and all of that, all those industries pay higher wages. As an example, the average large steel company is today paying its average steel worker over $100,000 a year. The average steel worker no longer works with hot molten metal. He works in a computer control room. And tariffs are a key way to stop the handicap this economy has due to an overvalued dollar and due to trade cheating from countries like China and Germany. So they're an absolutely essential tool.
Do you see an increase in job opportunities with increased tariffs?
Yes, I mean, mathematically, yes, we will see a higher labor force participation rate with increased tariffs because domestic production will rise and those jobs will attract people to get off the sofa and go out and get those jobs. But most crucially, I see a transition from people working for places like Jimmy John's at minimum wage into high-value jobs, which not only pay more today, but offer them career opportunities to get on a rising escalator.
Thank you. Mr. Antoni, Americans are upside down in credit card debt, $1.17 trillion. 85% of Americans have credit cards. 85% of Americans over 65 have a credit card. What can be done at the congressional level to encourage savings and keep more money in the pockets of Americans when it comes to credit?
Senator, thank you for the question. A big disincentive to save has historically been inflation, because as your money is sitting there in the bank, or even if it's in equities, whatever the case may be, much of the growth that it's experiencing is simply just the dollar losing value. So it doesn't really, there's not really much of an incentive there. If you want to get rid of inflation and you want to not only incentivize people to save, but disincentivize them from borrowing, you got to get inflation down. And I think the way you have to do that is by cutting government spending. The only other thing I would add is to help the people who are already in so much credit card debt, who are suffering with the combination of high credit card debt and high interest rates, is you need to get the interest rates down. And the interest rate is simply a price. It's the price to borrow money. If you want to reduce the price of something, reduce the demand. So reduce the demand for borrowed money. All marginal spending by this Congress is by definition borrowed. So if you reduce that spending, you will also reduce the demand for borrowed money and help bring interest rates down.
Thank you, Mr. Bragdon. You talk a lot about this unsustainable expansion of the federal welfare programs that have caused massive increase in spending, particularly SNAP. SNAP spending has grown by more than 73% since the last Farm Bill. It's predicted we'll spend more on SNAP in the next 10 years than we have in the last 2 decades. This is over the top. So what's your thoughts here, on this massive increase in the TFP, and what recommendations do you have to address this Farm Bill with SNAP?
Senator, thank you for the question. I think it's really twofold. One, the authority for setting the food stamp program, the SNAP program, really relies on Congress. And when you look at what the Biden administration did with the Thrifty Food Plan, by just through guidance, literally a bureaucrat with a pen and a power trip, dramatically increasing that benefit, and then that going, as my colleague said, into borrowed money and increasing interest rates, you also took away the incentive that people have to go into the workforce because it pays more not to work. And as I talked about, it drives even higher food inflation because SNAP benefits can only be used for food. And as we saw with the research that I cited, that drives increased demand and raises food prices. I think there's really twofold things that need to be done within the SNAP program. One is greater anti-fraud measures. If you look at the improper payments, that's fraud and waste within the SNAP program. That's primarily driven by individuals who are receiving benefits who are no longer eligible, either because an income change, they moved, or some other benefit change or life change. The second piece is really looking at how do we effectively use work requirements for working age, able-bodied adults. We've seen this work well with adults with no kids and disabilities. We recommend that pro-work, anti-poverty policy be expanded to more working age adults who have school-age children.
Thank you.
Senator Warning.
Thank you, Chair Scott. Today's hearing discussing the consequences of high prices on seniors could not be more timely. On Monday evening, the Trump administration ordered a total illegal freeze of federal taxpayer funds going out to communities and Georgians. This illegal funding freeze includes programs that are essential to seniors with lower and fixed incomes. I'm thankful that a federal judge temporarily halted this illegal freeze yesterday afternoon, but these programs are still at risk. The Trump administration, to be very clear, has rescinded the OMB memo. They have not rescinded the executive order. Mr. Lawson, will pauses to payments for nutrition programs or the Older Americans Act make food more affordable and accessible for seniors?
No, Senator, do the opposite.
So what they did on Monday night won't help?
It will hurt.
How about a pause on payments for federal housing vouchers? Will that help?
That will not help. That will also hurt.
And what about a pause on energy assistance funds?
Same answer. This won't help at all. It will only hurt seniors.
I would agree with that. Seniors, particularly those with modest means, rely on these funds to help pay for food, medicine, in-home care, rent, energy and heating bills in the dead of winter, and many other federal programs that ensure dignity throughout a person's life. This Trump freeze will hurt Georgia seniors, make life more expensive for them, including our veteran seniors who need care. Mr. Lawson, how can the federal government help bring down costs for seniors?
One of the best ways is to focus in on one of the key drivers that is really the rock in the hard place that seniors are in, the price of prescription drugs. For decades, pharmaceutical corporations have been able to raise the prices year after year enormously above the rate of inflation, of general inflation. They do it because they can. They do it for greed alone, and seniors pay the consequence of this. And that's too often having to cut their pills in half or forego their prescriptions or face the choice of, am I going to pay my rent or my heating bill or be able to afford my drugs this month? That is the reality that millions of Americans face. Now, President Biden and Democrats in Congress passed a bill that allows Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices for the first time ever. And there's been a reduction, there will be a reduction in the prices of some specific drugs. But what we could do is expand that to all drugs.
Absolutely.
Why get ripped off on any drugs?
Absolutely. And I'm proud that in that provision which caps the cost of prescription drugs, my insulin bill, which caps the cost of insulin to no more than $35 of out-of-pocket costs per month for seniors. Insulin shouldn't be expensive. And the fact that it is, or prior to our engagement in this area, speaks to the outsized influence of Big Pharma in our politics. On his first day in office, President Trump signed a wave of executive orders, and one of these executive orders rolled back an initiative that would empower Medicare prescription drugs to offer generic drugs that treat common chronic conditions for a flat $2 copay. Mr. Lawson, would capping the cost of medication at $2 help with seniors' ability to afford other essentials like groceries?
Absolutely. There's no doubt at all on that.
How do high prescription drug costs affect seniors also dealing with inflation?
So when a senior's forced to try to go get groceries and they can't afford those groceries and the $1,900 average Social Security cost per month, if their drug prices are going up month after month 13%, they're going to be able to even less able to afford those groceries. And we know that this price cap works because there is now a $2,000 price cap on prescription drugs in the same bill that put in negotiation. And that has freed the freedom that gives seniors from the anxiety of, will I be able to afford my next bag of groceries, is enormous.
Absolutely. In my remaining time, one last question. The Affordable Care Act established a premium tax credit to help everyday Americans afford their health care costs. Several years ago, Democrats in Congress passed legislation increasing the value of the premium tax credits to help families better afford health care while dealing with inflation. But if Congress fails to extend these tax credits before the end of the year, a 60-year-old couple in Georgia with a household income of, say, $80,000 will see their annual premium go up by $16,798. Mr. Lawson, how would extending the enhanced PTC support the fiscal sanity of seniors?
I mean, if it'd be fiscal insanity not to extend it and think that it'll do anything other than drive millions of older Americans into poverty, because you can't just increase a bill $16,000 and expect that money to just come from nowhere.
Thank you so much. I'm proud to serve on this committee. Also glad I'm on the Finance Committee. And while many of my colleagues will be focused on tax breaks for the wealthy, I'll be fighting for everyday Georgians to help them to be able to afford their health care. Thank you so much.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, an excellent hearing. And you've assembled a panel here, bipartisan, that actually agree on one thing, that inflation is really bad for seniors, and they pay a really heavy price. Let me put up a chart. This describes how bad it is. Because we've devalued our currency, a dollar Americans held in 1998 is now only worth 51 cents. A dollar you held only 10 years ago in 2014, or 12 years ago, is now worth 74 cents. A dollar we held before the pandemic started was about 80 cents. Now, where there is disagreement is what causes this. I think I agree with three of our witnesses that it's because of massive government spending, deficit spending, printing the dollar, too many dollars chasing too few goods. But Mr. Lawson believes it's because of price gouging. Mr. Antoni, I think you pretty well nuked that in your testimony. Can you explain to Mr. Lawson why he's so wrong?
I'd be happy to, Senator. If we look at the data published by the Biden administration, so these aren't my figures, this is from the Biden administration, we see that prices paid by businesses for all the things they buy actually rose faster than the prices paid by consumers. So when you go to the grocery store and you grab the gallon of milk off the shelf, the grocer had to buy that gallon of milk first in order to put it on that shelf for you. And the rate of increase that grocer has been paying has actually been higher than what consumers have been paying. And that's why when we look at corporate profits, they're really not up after adjusting for inflation. So
businesses literally, in order to maintain their market share and be able to sell products, shielded consumers from, some of the inflation caused by massive government spending, correct?
Exactly, and that's why wholesale inflation peaked much higher than retail inflation or consumer inflation.
So Mr. Lawson, you say you travel all over, you're talking to seniors. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If a family, let's say they have a major medical problem, and so one year they had to borrow $50,000 to take care of those medical bills, but then their family member gets well. Do families keep borrowing $50,000 and keep spending at that level even when they no longer have the illness?
Well, what I would hope is that Congress could come together and act so
Lawson,
that
just
no
answer,
family would have to borrow.
What would a typical family do? They would lower their spending and stop borrowing, correct? So let me put up my next chart here. So American families wouldn't do what the federal government did here. In 2019, before the pandemic, we spent $4.4 trillion. Then we went on a massive bipartisan spending spree, $6.6 trillion in 2020. The pandemic eventually wound down. Okay, we were actually coming well out of it by the end of 2020. We certainly didn't need the Inflation Reduction Act, which sparked 40-year high inflation. Last 5 years, we've averaged $6.5 trillion. Last year, we spent 6.9. This year, we'll probably spend about $7 trillion. Mr. Antoni, is there any justification for maintaining this level of spending now that the pandemic is over?
Senator, I suppose that depends on how much waste, fraud, and abuse you're willing to tolerate.
I'm
in
willing
your
to
budget.
tolerate none.
Well, in that case, then no, there is absolutely no justification for the figures on your chart there.
So I've given my colleagues a number of options to return to a pre-pandemic level spending. One of them was, if you go back to Bill Clinton's 1998 budget, where we actually had a surplus. And by the way, 40 Senate Republicans voted for that, and they voted for the appropriation bills. But if you go back to there and you increase that spending level for population growth and inflation, and you use this year's, Biden's Social Security and Medicare, so you hold those programs harmless, that they are as they are, and interest according to President Biden's budget, we would have a spending level of $5.5 trillion. But President Biden's projecting $5.5 trillion of revenue. That's how close we are to a balanced budget. Is that reasonable, Mr. Ferry?
I don't think I followed all your numbers, Senator. You're saying that the Clinton budget of 1998 would lead to tax revenue of...
No, what I'm saying is that back then it was $1.7 trillion because the dollar was worth more. But if you inflate that $1.7 trillion by population growth and inflation, but for Social Security, Medicare, and interest, you use this year's number, we'd be spending at $5.5 trillion. We'd basically have a balanced budget. If you do Clinton for 2014, do the same thing, you'd have about $6.2 trillion. Again, that would be a reasonable pre-pandemic level of spending to return to. And again, those are President Clinton's spending priorities. Again, as I lay out these numbers, I'm one of the few people here that I'm an accountant. I actually use numbers. I look at history. My colleagues are actually shocked at how reasonable that spending level is. So I guess I'm just trying to get some comments. I mean, anybody want to challenge that's not a reasonable spending level to return to? Now, again, we can spend on different things, but we shouldn't be spending at $7 trillion level, over 50% higher than the start of the pandemic when population is only growing 2%. That was, Senator Scott made that comparison. Spending was up to something like 60% in one analysis. Population is only growing 2%. There's no justification for that, correct?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. The federal government has broadened and widened its interest in various areas, producing very little in all these areas when what it should be doing is focusing on those entitlements, including senior citizens. And this needs to be pared back dramatically and radically.
So, Mr. Chairman, just one quick question. In Mr. Antoni's testimony, you say that interest payments in December 2024 were $140 billion. Now, the interest expense I've been using in my analysis here was Biden's budget number at $965. You're saying that interest is going to be $1.2 trillion, but even the 140 comes out to about $1.6, $1.7 trillion. So I'm sure there's a timing difference in terms of interest payments. But is Biden that far off in terms of his 2025 interest expense of $965? Is it really going to be $1.2 trillion or more?
Well, Senator, I think what the Biden administration was probably referencing there was net interest, which is frankly kind of a made-up category. They take gross interest, the actual cost of servicing the debt, and then they subtract out a bunch of interest sources of income to the U.S. Treasury. And that's where we get this net interest figure. But again, it's not the actual cost of servicing the debt. For this calendar year, you're looking at about $1.2 trillion just for that one expense alone.
But again, if it flows through the budget, it is net interest. So the 965 is a reasonably accurate number then?
For net interest.
For net interest. Okay, that's what I want to know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on being the chairman. Mr. Lawson, on Monday night, the Trump administration announced that federal funding and grants were paused. This has created a chaotic situation in the state of Arizona. Yesterday, my office was fielding calls all day from folks trying to understand what this means and what was happening on all kinds of programs, asking how they could be sure that they'd have the money to continue to operate. Meals on Wheels National didn't have clarity on what the funding freeze meant for them. They were receiving conflicting information out of the administration. That means that our local programs in Arizona were also getting mixed information, and folks who provide meals to seniors didn't know what the impact would be on their ability to continue to deliver these meals. And obviously, this means that seniors didn't have a guarantee of where their next meal would come from. Now, I've delivered meals to seniors in their homes, and it was obvious to me that if I didn't show up, they weren't going to have anything to eat. And then on top of that, the administration then, they defended the order all day yesterday, said this was a great idea. This afternoon, it seemed like they wanted to walk it back. But unfortunately, for seniors in Arizona and across the country, they just muddied the waters even more. Now, while I believe that the initial action that the administration took was illegal, the past 48 hours have also been irresponsible, reckless, and absolutely unacceptable. So, Mr. Lawson, can you talk about how disruptive this kind of government action is and the stress that this causes to seniors and those community organizations that support them?
It's basically incalculable. The messages that we receive of people just in full distress because they do not know if they're going to have a meal to eat. They're hearing all sorts of information. When the press secretary for the White House is asked whether Medicaid is going to exist, she says, I'm going to have to check on that and get back to you. What that means for a senior in Arizona across the country is they don't know if they're going to have health care. They might have an upcoming appointment. Do they need to reschedule that? All of this uncertainty, it's chaos, and it inflicts real harm on seniors. But the only thing worse than that sort of incompetent chaos are the plans to legislatively make those cuts permanently, right? Which is what we've seen, targeting Meals on Wheels, targeting Medicaid, targeting the exact programs that the president unconstitutionally tried to unilaterally stop funding. So your question is incredibly important, and I can't express strongly enough the distress that this brings to Americans who've worked hard all their lives, they've followed the rules, and then when they expect the system to be there for them, like an 89-year-old relying on Meals on Wheels, they're going to get an answer from somebody that's like, oh, well, they could go get a job at Jimmy John's, right? We've heard that multiple times now in this committee, that the problem is that not enough people are going to work. This is a hearing about seniors. This is a hearing. Do you think that an 89-year-old can go get a job at Jimmy John's because their health care was taken away? No, they can't. Congress cannot steal people's benefits that they've earned because the people will stand up against that.
Well, the people that I met that were receiving these meals, not only were they elderly, they were often disabled. They're not working at Jimmy John's or anywhere else for that matter. And they rely on this to just have some, it's their food. They don't have any place else to go. And often, in some cases, what I felt and is the person that shows up that day to bring them that food, that might be the only interaction that they get with anybody. So it's even more, the damage is even beyond, just the meal. It's the lack of the social interaction that they will get from somebody showing up at their doorstep to deliver this. And I don't have a lot of faith in this getting resolved quickly, but it needs to get resolved. and in a way that brings certainty to the folks that I represent and seniors across the country. Thank you, Mr. Lawson.
Senator Husted.
Thank you for the opportunity to join my committee members, ranking member, and Chairman Scott. I know that I'm excited to work with him and the rest of the committee members. I do have a question for Mr. Antoni that I think perhaps you can help from your background and research provide some insight into, because we're talking about the needs of senior citizens. And from my experience of traveling my state of Ohio over a lifetime, the past few years with dramatic inflation has really hit seniors hard. These are folks who, after a lifetime of work, are dependent on Social Security, retirement savings that they might have, which certainly is not seeing returns at the rate of inflation. You see the cost of food, cost of housing, the cost of energy, which is built into every single consumer product that they buy. You see the punishing nature of inflation in their lives. And I am interested in, from your background and your research, what is it, what has been the impact, the real impact of inflation in the lives of seniors? And then what recommendations do you have on how we can continue to attack the insidious nature of these inflationary costs?
Well, thank you, Senator. I would say the impact is best described as a quality of life decrease or a cost of living increase. We have dramatically increased that cost of living on American seniors who are probably the least able to accommodate, their budgets are least able to accommodate those higher costs because of exactly what you were just describing, the fixed nature of their incomes. And even the portions of their incomes which do have those COLAs, those cost of living increases, they tend to happen very infrequently. So you're stuck with an entire year of cost increases, let's say, before that COLA actually does kick in. On top of that, you have a very serious worry now with things like pension funds, which have lost about $2.5 trillion in inflation-adjusted value under the Biden administration. And that's a combination of both asset classes underperforming and also just inflation reducing the real value of those nominal holdings. And so at the same time, so many of these seniors are having to pay more to live. They also are seeing the value of the monies on which they rely go down. So it's really a double whammy for those folks. And they're just having to cut back, unfortunately. Again, speaks to that lower quality of life, higher cost of living. In terms of the second part of your question, what can we do to fix this problem? The one good piece of news here is the fact that all of these wounds are just self-inflicted. In other words, if we reverse the bad policies that got us here, we'll reverse the bad effects. And the number one way to do that is to cut the excess government spending that has been talked about so much today. Now, there are some other things that are going to help. For example, Senator, you mentioned energy. You're absolutely right. The price of energy affects everything we do and everything we buy. So if you return to the energy policies of, let's say, the first Trump administration, that would have a tremendous impact on boosting production. One of the things I mentioned in the written portion of my testimony is that we are drastically below trend in terms of the growth in energy production. So again, you increase production, you increase supply, that means you'll decrease price. That's not just the price of energy, that puts downward pressure on prices everywhere. Lastly, deregulation would have a tremendous impact. One of the studies cited in my testimony explains that the average American family faces an additional $50,000 in regulatory compliance costs because of the policies of the Biden administration. So rolling back those burdensome regulations would save everyone, including seniors, a tremendous amount of money.
Yeah, thank you. It is, if you really look at how much energy prices are built into food, whether it's the cost of planting, the cost of the raw material, natural gas that is part of the fertilizing process, the harvesting, the transportation. There's just a huge input into a lot of the foods we eat, and any way that we can tackle the cost of energy, I know affects, that's just food prices, not to mentioned the fact that you've seen housing inflation, the cost of things going to housing inflation. It's great when people see their property values rise if they're going to sell them, but most seniors are not selling these properties. They're trying to live in them, and it's why it has a disproportionate effect on them. So thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Lawson, in your testimony, you mentioned the Social Security Cost of Living Adjustment, otherwise known as the COLA. The COLA is a key component to keep up with rising costs, yet we know that COLA often doesn't adequately capture the costs incurred by older adults. This is why I've supported the Boosting Benefits and COLAs Act. Can you tell me why the COLA calculation is currently insufficient? And what can we do to ensure that Social Security benefits remain adequate during times of inflation?
The current cost of living adjustment, which, just to be clear, is part of a benefit. We pay for our Social Security benefits, including the COLA. It's not some sort of gift. The idea of Social Security is that it will freeze your standard of living and increase with inflation. The benefits will increase with inflation so that your standard of living doesn't go down. The problem is that the COLA is calculated using the CPI-W, which looks at the costs faced by your average worker, which are very different than the costs faced by your average senior or person with disability. Primarily, this is going to be in medical, in the medical category. So, as you know, the bill that you support and the efforts to switch to a better CPI for the COLA, the CPI-E, which would more accurately reflect seniors' costs.
Thank you. We heard in Mr. Antoni's testimony today that if Congress wants to alleviate the pain inflicted on Americans, especially older Americans, then lawmakers should make drastic cuts to government spending. I think we can read between the lines and understand that Mr. Antoni really wants Congress to make drastic cuts to seniors' Social Security, Medicare, and SNAP, but maintain and expand tax breaks for the wealthiest in America. Mr. Lawson, what would happen to tens of millions of older adults who receive Social Security if Republicans were to make these, quote, drastic cuts to their benefits, particularly those older adults who don't qualify for other federal programs?
It's really straightforward. People would be harmed. People would die. People would be pushed into poverty. Millions of people. The current poverty rate among seniors is around 14%. It's right around, it's too high, obviously, but it's right around where the average rate is for the general population. Without Social Security, that number would be 40%. 40%. And you have millions of seniors who are just eking it out with the current average $1,900 a month. To literally reach into people's pockets and steal that money so that a billionaire can buy another golden yacht with their trillions of dollars in tax handouts, it's deeply un-American, it's immoral, and I can never get it through my head how people can't see how wrong that path is.
Mr. Antoni, do you want to respond to his thoughts on your statement?
Which part, Senator?
Well, the poverty created by cutting Social Security benefits.
Senator, I'm not aware of any proposals to actually cut Social Security, so I'm not sure how to address that. In terms of your own characterization of my testimony, if you actually read my testimony, and I'm happy to provide you a copy, nowhere in there do I advocate for cutting Social Security benefits, so I'm not sure where that's coming from.
It comes from the rhetoric across the country right now. It also...
With all due respect, Senator, I don't represent the country. I simply represent my own views. That's what I've been asked to testify on here today. And in my own views, there are no cuts to Social Security. So again, I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Talk about your cuts to SNAP. How would you address seniors who are hungry?
Again, Senator, I'm not advocating for any cuts to SNAP, so I'm not sure where this is coming from. That is found nowhere in my testimony.
Where are you planning on cutting then? Where are your drastic cuts from?
I would start with the low-hanging fruit of waste, fraud, and abuse throughout the government.
Which waste and which fraud and which abuse in which
Oh,
program?
Senator, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And
give me
there are no sacred cows here,
Give me
by the
one.
way. Literally,
Just
again.
give me a few $100 billion that are waste, fraud, and abuse. Just give me a few $100 billion, since we have to make up over $1 trillion to pay the debt on our debt and deficit.
Oh, certainly. Well, Senator, a very easy way to do that would simply be to revert back to pre-COVID spending levels.
Absolutely not. That's not correct, and I'll explain why. COVID was such a dramatic crush to the U.S. economy, such an unconscionable disaster to the U.S. economy. Businesses closed all across America. Schools were closed. 5 million women lost their jobs because they had to stay home so their kids could get school by Zoom. So that's what happened during COVID. And in fact, we realized pretty quickly that our social service safety nets weren't effective during COVID because so many of them required you to turn up in person to fill out a form or to get a benefit. SNAP was one of them. So one of the changes we did very quickly in SNAP was to let people apply online. So the increase in the number of people who had access to SNAP is not because people were lazy and stopped working or because people weren't doing their fair share. It's because the people who actually were qualified were finally getting the benefit that it was made for. It's not that somehow there was abuse of the program or somehow people decided that they wanted to get free food. That many people needed access to the SNAP program before COVID. But because we recognized it wasn't working to have to show up in person and letting people apply, it fixed the program. So no, that's not true. A lot of the things we did in COVID was to fix things that weren't working and we didn't understand until we saw the impacts of COVID. I'm past my time. I'm now going to refer back to the chairman.
Thank you. Senator Moody.
Thank you so much.
Is this your first time to ask questions at a committee?
Yes, it is. Not my first committee appearance, but yes, my first asking of questions, so you should all be very afraid. Thank you, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gillibrand. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be among you on this committee, and let me just say, I know this has gone on for a little bit, and we're just really grateful that all of you were willing to show up today and testify. Thank you so much. This is an important hearing, especially for states like Florida. We have nearly 6 million residents that are over the age of 60, so we feel many of them living on a fixed income. So our residents certainly feel the effects of inflation. And this is a problem all across the nation, but certainly we are feeling it in Florida as well. We know that this has been caused certainly in part by the enormous spending that has taken place under the last administration. As Attorney General, I fought against agencies constantly, not just for overreaching policies, but sometimes spending decisions that I don't think were lawful either. And I think it all contributed to the excessive spending. I look forward to serving on this committee. I look forward to, I've enjoyed hearing not only your original testimony, but your responses to the questions. It's been incredibly helpful as one of the newest senators here in the United States Senate, number 99 to be exact. But one of the things, Mr. Antoni, that I heard you talk about, of course, your testimony included an analysis of how the spending has contributed to the rapid increase in inflation. But one of the things you talked about, it may have been in response to one of my colleagues' questions, was how the Fed might have also played a role in this, and certain monetary policy decisions may have played a role in this. And so I wanted to just ask you a few questions about that. Number one, do you believe that's the case?
Oh, absolutely, Senator. As one colleague of mine describes it, if Congress is the bank robber, the Fed is the getaway driver. So Congress is the one who initiates this excess spending, but then it is the Federal Reserve that finances it. And the way they do that is by simply creating money out of nothing, just simply ex nihilo. And the result of that is a dilution of the value of the dollar.
And do you believe currently there is enough transparency and accountability of the Fed?
Oh, not at all. Absolutely not, Senator. And one of the best ways to observe that, I think, is if you just simply follow their rhetoric around the time of the election. So significantly before the election, they were talking about how we're going to need much higher interest rates for a very long period of time. And then all of a sudden, right before the election, despite the fact that the underlying data had not changed, they all of a sudden completely changed their view that somehow we were going to get a lot of interest rate cuts and very quickly. And they actually did start cutting interest rates, and they started telling us that inflation was essentially solved. And then right after the election, they have once again changed their tune and gone back to saying inflation looks like it's going to be around a little bit longer, and we're going to have these higher interest rates for longer as well.
And certainly when those announcements were made about the interest rates coming down right before the election, there was no change in spending.
Correct. That's absolutely right, Senator. And so, again, to your point, the underlying problem here has not been solved, and yet the Federal Reserve treated it as if it was.
And what would be your suggestions or recommendations on how we might bring more transparency or oversight to the Fed?
I think probably the best way to make it transparent would be to simply get rid of it. But if you're going to have a central bank, I think you need to have much less government control over it. It needs to be the bank for bankers and not the bank for Congress.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Moody. Senator also Brooks.
Thank you, and good afternoon to Chair Scott and Ranking Member Gillibrand, and to our speakers today. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a long day. I'm going to direct my questions today at Alex Lawson. And I have to tell you, this issue is one that is quite personal to me. I am a part of the sandwich generation, which means that I am not only raising a wonderful 19-year-old daughter, but I am also the daughter to two aging parents, a mother who has significant needs and my father who is her caregiver. And two issues I just want to ask you about that have been mentioned quite frequently throughout the state of Maryland are housing concerns for our seniors, as well as the cost of prescription drug medications. These are two issues that I believe all across the state, and without respect for party, this is an issue that has been of grave concern. And so my question to you is regarding the Inflation Reduction Act, which did cap the cost of prescription drug medications. And I have to tell you again how significant this is. My father is a person who went last year, was diagnosed with a heart arrhythmia, and learned that Eliquis was $800. Cost prohibitive, caused him tremendous distress. And so my question to you is whether you believe that this has been, to just discuss how it's impacted seniors, and to talk about what would happen were this not available to seniors. So just if you could just briefly discuss the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act for seniors.
The American people pay the highest drug prices in the world, somewhere between 3 and 8 times higher than any other country. This despite the fact that our tax dollars go to the research and development, which develops almost all of these drugs. Then the pharmaceutical corporations turn around and charge us the highest prices in the world. Because they can, because there's never been a check on their greed until the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And it had many pieces to it, but the two important ones are it allowed Medicare to negotiate a lower prescription drug price with the pharmaceutical corporations. That's the part that they hate the most, because they want to be able to charge whatever they want. And I'll also say what they want is a price that's so high that some people die. You look at insulin and you see this very clearly. They want some people to die so everyone else is terrified enough to spend every dollar they have and every dollar they can borrow to afford the drugs that they or a loved one needs. Finally, the Congress acts and says, no, you can't charge whatever you want. You have to charge a fair price. And that just started, and seniors will be seeing those reduced prices next year. Now, there's a lot to do there. We could just do all drugs right away instead of just some drugs. But on the other hand, they also, what you brought up is the Inflation Reduction Act capped what seniors pay out of their pocket at $2,000 a year, right? That's enormous, enormous. Insulin capped at $35 out of pocket for people on Medicare. Vaccinations free. The impact that the Inflation Reduction Act had on seniors cannot be overstated.
Thank you. And likewise, I know I'm running out of time here. Just one other quick question regarding housing, which is a big issue. Maryland has a senior assisted living subsidy program, which helps adults 62 and older pay for assisted living programs that they would otherwise not be able to afford. And so how can housing subsidy programs be a part of the solution to help seniors who are struggling with high cost of living?
Housing subsidies are a solution to seniors struggling with the cost of housing, which is happening across the country, is a major issue. And so the idea that has been brought up by my colleagues at the table, they talk about drastic cuts. They talk about all these big cuts, but then when they're what are you going to cut? They suddenly get amnesia of their own plans that they've written down. Chairman Scott wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal giving himself kudos for being brave enough to say, we're going to cut Social Security and Medicare. Right now, they go down the line. They say, we're definitely not going to cut those programs. But when pressed, they won't say what they're going to cut. It's written down. Housing assistance, food assistance, Medicaid, Medicare, and yes, Social Security are on the chopping block, all so that giant tax handouts can be given to billionaires and these multinational corporations.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lawson.
Mr. Lawson, first off, you just said a complete lie. I have a bill that would protect Medicare and Social Security, and there's not one Democrat that got on the bill. I have fought to protect Medicare and Social Security since I've been up here, and that was a complete lie. But let me ask you a question. You just said drug companies want people to die. Can you explain that better?
The easiest one to see is the insulin cartel. There's 3 companies that produce insulin, a drug that costs about $6 per vial to make. Now, these 3 companies have increased the price year after year in lockstep, illegally acting as a cartel, and charge upwards of $300 a vial. Now, you can Google just insulin death, and you will find story after story, and many of them are of 27-year-old people. Why? Or 26-year-old. They just got kicked off of their parents' insurance. They're just footing the bill for the first time, so they're trying to stretch their insulin, and what happens is they go into ketoacidosis and die. Now, if the pharmaceutical corporations wanted that not to happen, there's a million things they could do. They could have an emergency program so that no one would ever not be able to afford their insulin, but they don't want that.
So has anybody ever sued a drug company for wanting people to die?
A ton of attorney generals have actually taken on the insulin cartel.
Wait. You said they want people to die. That's what you said.
Yes.
So do you know of any lawsuits against the pharmaceutical industry because and I guess you must have evidence, so like, do they have emails that say they want people to die? Is that, how do you have this information?
I infer it through their actions of keeping prices so high that people die.
You said that you know that they want people to die. Do you have, if you're going to say that, I think you would have like some testimony or an email, or you've talked to somebody at a drug company. Like, do you know people at drug companies, and you know people there that are out there working every day to get people to die?
Senator, let me be super clear. What I said is the prices that they charge are high enough.
Hold on. You said they want people to die. That's what you said. Those were your words.
Prices high enough so that some people die, so that everyone else is terrified enough.
Let's go on. That's not what you said. You said they want people to die. In 2023, the Social Security Administration reported there was an estimated 2.7 workers for each Social Security beneficiary. Mr. Lawson, what's the estimate for 2030?
What the actuaries continually say is that the worker-dependent ratio is not at all a factor in the trust fund insolvency, that's entirely because of the ultra-wealthy and billionaires not paying into the fund.
That doesn't make any sense. Let's think about this first. Somebody's got to pay in, right? And so you have to have workers to pay in. So in 2030, it's going to be 2.4 workers for everybody on retirement. That is a problem. So American workers fuel the Social Security Trust Fund. That's how it's set up, right? The more people there are in the workforce, the more people there's going to be contributing to the Security Trust Fund. I think there's an excess of 50 million Americans now between, I think, 15 and 64 that are not in the workforce. Now, some of them are probably retired. Some of them probably can't work, all sorts of things. So what is your proposal, all right? Does your group have a proposal to get more people into the workforce?
What we would propose is a solution that would address the problem, which is that billionaires don't pay the same rate into Social Security as the rest of us, and that is what the actuaries say drives the entire problem, not the worker dependency ratio.
Do you have the proposal?
I have a proposal that would solve the problem, not one that would aim at something that does not factor in.
Can you send me the proposal?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's Senator Sanders' bill. I'm a co-sponsor.
So
Blow the cap. It's the blow the cap bill. Create a donut hole so someone who earns less than $400,000, but more than what the current top number is, which is what,
176.
Yeah, 176 right now, that they don't pay any additional, but that you get that 6% for all income above $400,000. That's the bill.
Mr. Antoni, the Social Security Trust Fund is funded by American workers. We must preserve and protect the benefits of Social Security. But again, if fewer workers are working, that's going to become a major challenge. How has the weak labor participation rate impacted our ability to fund Social Security? Wouldn't increasing the labor force help drive the Social Security Trust Fund back towards solvency?
Absolutely, Senator. One of the devastating impacts of the last 4 years of anti-work, if you want to call it that, anti-work policies has been to reduce payroll tax receipts. And so if we look at, for example, Social Security and Medicare, what you might call the missing tax receipts just to those two programs amounts to about $500 billion. So to your point, yes, that is speeding us to insolvency of those programs.
Mr. Ferry, over the last 4 years, the federal debt has increased by $8 trillion. Federal spending is up 55%. So we've had about a 2% increase in population, and we've had this unbelievable increase. We've got $36 trillion worth of debt. How is this I think you've talked about this as an existential threat to our economy. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this is absolutely, Senator. Thank you for the question. A debt of 120 or 130% of GDP sounds like an existential crisis for the United States of America. As you know, and probably most people on the panel know, some of the most respected economists in the world have published a study which put 80% as a key threshold. When countries get above 80% of GDP in debt, then they tend to hit a downward slide where investors start to get very skeptical of whether this country is ever going to pay back that money. And we could go look at the history of countries like Greece and Italy and Brazil and Argentina where that problem arises. The United States is in a much more central position in the world economy. We've got very attractive investments in the tech industry and in government bonds, but we are not immune to this problem. And a growing number of investors around the world, and I do talk to investors at sovereign wealth funds in countries that have large amounts of money invested in the United States. I recently met with one from Singapore, and this $36 trillion of debt does arouse worries and make them start looking for alternative investments in what you could call a post-imperial America age, and that fills me with fear, I have to say.
Thank you. Mr. Bragdon, can you talk about how much money we could save for seniors if we reduce the regulatory environment?
Sure. Thank you for the question. We've been talking about how big spending drives big inflation and big interest payments. A lot of that spending over the last 4 years wasn't driven by appropriations from Congress. It was driven by executive fiat, by expanding spending through regulations and guidance of the Biden administration. And then, as my colleague noted, having to borrow money or create money to pay for that spending. I've outlined in the testimony some of those key red tape regulations that have driven that testimony, that have created expansions of the welfare state, have encouraged folks to remain on benefit programs beyond their eligibility, have also driven up costs across the board in particular industries. And so rolling back that red tape, just as you did as governor of Florida, boosts the economy, gets more people working, providing more tax receipts that then undergird the safety net for seniors.
Thank you. Ranking Member Gillibrand, do you have any other questions?
I just want to thank this panel for your dedication and your passion and your willingness to help guide us in these very important decisions we have to make.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here today and participating. Look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues. If any senators have additional questions for the witnesses or statements to be added, the hearing record will be open until next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Thanks.